Imagine you are sitting across from me right now, in a completely silent, sterile room where there is absolutely no space for the comforting lies you have been telling yourself in front of the mirror for years. You have spent your entire life being conditioned by a cultural narrative that insists you must demonstrate your feelings, bleed your emotions in public, and constantly verbalize your inner vulnerabilities if you want to keep a woman. And that precise conditioning is the exact reason why you continue to be discarded, disrespected, and rendered invisible by the very women you try so desperately to please. As a researcher of human behavior, I observe men completely destroying their own intrinsic value every single day. I watch them crawling, silently pleading for validation, and genuinely convinced that they simply aren't being emotional enough whenever their partner voices a complaint, creates chaos, or demands a reaction. But what behavioral science actually shows us is brutally unforgiving and entirely indifferent to modern social dogmas. The female mind possesses an absolute, uncompromising biological radar, a primal instinct hardwired deeply into the limbic system that detects invisible psychological weaknesses with surgical precision. This evolutionary mechanism operates entirely independently of your financial status, your physical symmetry, or your endless capacity for kindness. When a woman looks at you and complains that you are being too cold or emotionally unavailable, her primal instinct is not actually requesting more emotional warmth. That is the flawed cultural translation, not the biological reality. What she is doing is running a ruthless stress test. She is testing to see if you are strong enough not to melt under the pressure of her discontent. Consider the captain of a massive ship navigating through a violent Category 5 hurricane. The passengers below deck have every right to scream, to panic, and to allow their terror to consume them. But if the captain abandons the helm, sits on the deck, and begins to cry alongside them to show his empathy, everyone on that ship dies. Why, then, do you believe that continuously handing over your emotional stability on a silver platter has become anything other than the fastest shortcut to becoming the sexless, agreeable provider, a man she might tolerate for his utility but will never biologically desire? You have been systematically poisoned by an unseen cultural enemy that has completely destroyed your natural instinctive compass. The modern conditioning of the Western world, the rise of a therapy culture that pathologizes male stoicism, the participation trophy mindset that shields men from necessary friction, and a post-feminist media landscape that demands absolute emotional transparency, has castrated your natural behavioral responses. You have been led to believe that sovereign stillness is somehow dangerous, that emotional detachment is toxic, and that you must morph into a harmless people-pleaser to be loved. You have been lied to your entire life. Society lies to you with criminal negligence when it dictates that extreme vulnerability is the only bridge to true human connection, demanding that you perform your emotional bleeding in the public square for everyone to applaud. But here is the terrifying paradox you are trapped inside. While modern social discourse demands that you be fragile, agreeable, and endlessly accommodating, her primitive biological selection strictly and violently rejects males who are incapable of regulating their own emotions in the face of chaos. The cultural narrative tells you to open up. Her evolutionary hardware actively punishes you the moment you do. Your cold, calculated stability is the absolute only boundary that her biology is actually forced to respect. Brother, I want you to look back at your own historical data. Look at the empirical evidence of your past relationships. How many times have you desperately tried to explain yourself, surrendered your personal space, and compromised your boundaries just to keep the peace, only to be summarily punished with the total and irreversible loss of her respect. You have willingly demoted yourself to the status of a dusty consolation prize, sitting quietly on the forgotten shelf of the friend zone. You live your life constantly walking on eggshells, carrying the suffocating weight of believing that you are somehow an inadequate monster because you cannot endlessly cater to her shifting moods. I am not judging your exhaustion. You are not wrong for feeling this profound, silent pain. But the absolute root cause of this invisible failure is not a lack of love, nor is it a lack of effort. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of how human attraction is actually built and destroyed. What I am about to reveal to you now is what absolutely no one has had the clinical courage to tell you to your face, because the truth extracts a very high price from the man who prefers to beg for affection rather than command respect. I need you to stay until the very end and listen with clinical detachment, because I am going to hand you the precise behavioral map required to hack this cultural conditioning. I am going to show you how to turn your calculated stillness into the most devastating weapon of attraction she has ever encountered. Tell me in the comments, have you ever made yourself smaller to keep someone who never truly chose you? I read everything. What comes next will permanently alter the way you perceive every single female movement, test, and complaint. I didn't learn this only from books. I observed it, studied it, verified it across hundreds of cases, and watched how the human mind operates beneath the mask of socialization. Your greatest mistake was never the fact that you possess emotions. Your fatal error is failing to understand what happens to her brain chemistry in the exact millisecond you apologize for being who you are. In the precise fraction of a second that you apologize for holding your ground or back down from your own masculine frame just to appease her, her brain registers a catastrophic drop in your biological value. At that moment, her primal attraction to you plummets, and often it is an irreversible descent. As a researcher of human behavior, I can state this to you with absolute, undeniable clarity. Your passive attempts to play the nice guy, the validation seeker who is endlessly available and endlessly accommodating, are never interpreted by her nervous system as moral virtues. Instead, they are processed as a pathetic absence of leadership, a complete lack of personal sovereignty, and a biological repellent that destroys arousal. True sovereign stillness is not the depressive apathy of a man who is dead inside. It is the elite emotional control of a man who actively chooses not to react to that which is trivial. What behavioral science demonstrates, particularly through the exhaustive intercultural studies conducted by evolutionary psychologists like David Buss, is an undeniable reality. Female psychology prioritizes emotional stability, resourcefulness, and maturity at the absolute pinnacle of mate selection. This specific trait guarantees predictability and resilience. It signals to her primal brain that you are capable of protecting resources and maintaining order when all hell breaks loose. Your emotional self-control must operate exactly like a military-grade smoke detector. This elite piece of equipment solemnly ignores the harmless steam coming from a hot shower. It only triggers alarms and initiates action in the presence of a genuine, destructive fire. If you are the kind of man who reacts to every wisp of false smoke just to prove to her that you care, you are instinctively confessing that you lack the internal center of gravity required to lead your own world. The exact biological mechanics of your relational failure occur because remaining entirely submissive to external drama completely destroys sexual tension at its deepest evolutionary root. When you continuously attempt to accommodate every single mood swing, when you bend your reality just to avoid displeasing her, you are broadcasting a glaring red signal of genetic weakness. What behavioral research and the immunocompetence handicap hypothesis clearly prove is that the endocrine profile associated with the highest levels of male attractiveness is a highly specific combination: elevated testosterone coupled with extremely low cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone. Low cortisol is the biological signature of unshakable dominance. It proves that the environment does not overwhelm you. It shows that you can carry the heavy metabolic burden of masculinity without your nervous system panicking. The true trigger for female desire is perfectly captured by the metaphor of the loaded gun. It is the immense, quiet potential for controlled aggression. I am not speaking of physical violence or tyranny. I am speaking of the undeniable physical presence of a man who imposes severe boundaries, who possesses the absolute capacity to push back if the situation requires it, and who fundamentally never begs for affection. Her biology responds instinctively to your absolute refusal to panic. How many times, my friend, have you swallowed your own dignity, forced a smile when you actually wanted to slam your fist on the table, and castrated your most primitive instincts solely to avoid a conflict that she herself initiated? When your nervous system collapses into appeasement, it communicates to her limbic system that your armor is made of cheap plastic. Reacting emotionally to her manufactured chaos does not prove the depth of your love. It clinically signs your own declaration of genetic inferiority. The real consequence of continuing to operate under the submissive parameters of the agreeable man is a slow, deeply humiliating annihilation of your indisputable authority within the power dynamic. Over the long term, attempting to be the perfect conciliator, the flawless listener who never pushes back, turns you into an absolute slave to your own internal state. You end up handing over the crown of your own kingdom at the very first sign of turbulence. If you allow yourself to be dysregulated by the chaotic behavior of another person, you instinctively confess that you are the weakest element in the equation and that your entire reality is now tethered to her whims. The suffocating discomfort you are feeling right now as you listen to this is not some abstract, empty theory. It is the bitter taste of self-recognition. It is what happens when you look back and see exactly how many times you surrendered control in the childish hope of being loved, only to harvest surgical disinterest and continuous discarding. You handed over your mental sovereignty for free to someone who, in the deepest recesses of her own biology, was desperately yearning for you to be unbreakable enough to categorically deny her that very surrender. The female instinct possesses a profound, silent contempt for the man who can be tamed by a mere annoyance. It punishes this chronic weakness with the ruthless removal of any sexual desire or reverence. And this is exactly why the most dangerous trap her primal instinct will ever set for you will never sound like a direct, aggressive attack. It will sound exactly like a simple complaint, disguised as a plea for emotional intimacy. This simple complaint, often veiled in tears, frustration, or distant coldness, is the most lethal biological auditing mechanism the female mind possesses. After years of studying human behavior, evolutionary biology, and the cognitive structures of attraction, what I am about to tell you will permanently alter the framework through which you view every single interaction with women. In the instinctive female dictionary, the phrase, "you are so cold," or "you don't open up to me," is almost never a genuine romantic request for more affection. It is an authentic load-bearing test. It is meticulously engineered in her subconscious to check whether your psychological structure is still forged from solid steel, or if it is beginning to buckle under pressure. The value of a man in the reproductive dynamic is measured scientifically by his capacity to exist without requiring external validation. This is an uncompromising biological fact, not a comforting self-help philosophy designed to make you feel better. In behavioral biology, these provocations from the female are not actual demands for you to change your fundamental nature. They are continuous, merciless verifications of your ability to maintain your protective frame under extreme stress. Think of the rigorous crash tests applied to high-performance vehicles. The automotive engineer does not accelerate the car into a solid concrete wall because he hates the vehicle. He crashes it because he requires absolute empirical certainty that the passenger cabin will not be crushed upon impact. She needs that aggressive collision. She hurls the complaint directly at your chest because she desperately needs to feel secure in the unshakable resistance of your mental structure when a crisis hits. If you crumple, you fail the crash test, and she will never trust you behind the wheel again. The mechanics of emotional detachment perfectly explain why the man who does not need is the absolute only man capable of holding total control over any power dynamic. In primate hierarchies and human behavioral biology, the lack of reactivity to a provocation is not classified as apathy. It is universally recognized as an honest signal of superior dominance. When you do not alter your baseline state, your physiology communicates that your status is so unquestionably elevated that this external emotional fluctuation poses zero threat to your survival. You must learn to operate like a massive iron anchor embedded deeply into the bedrock at the bottom of the ocean. The storm raging on the surface may destroy ships, generate chaotic whirlpools, and raise violent, crushing waves, but the anchor remains cold, static, and entirely undisturbed in the depths, perfectly stabilizing the entire structure above. The complete disaster occurs in the exact second you attempt to justify yourself, to apologize, or to overcompensate simply because you were labeled as cold. The moment you begin to explain yourself, you violently rip your own anchor from the seabed, and you are immediately swallowed whole by her chaotic currents. I am asking you directly right now, when was the last time you acted from a place of non-negotiable internal value, without silently begging for her approval? The moment you lose your frame and rush to comfort her unwarranted accusations, your armor is revealed to be made of papier-mâché, dissolving at the first drop of rain. Your desperate justification hands her the clinical proof that your initial strength was nothing more than a temporary, fragile mask. Clinical silence in the face of an absurd demand consolidates your immediate authority because it installs an invisible courtroom inside her mind. In this psychological courtroom, the out-of-control defendant is the one who convicts themselves simply by speaking too much. The subconscious recognition of your leadership, generated entirely by your unbothered stillness, is instantaneous and lethal. If what I just explained resonated, subscribe to this channel. What you heard today is only the entry point. Every week I go deeper into a layer most men will never see. Absolute dominance begins with the brutal comprehension that relational power dynamics are never based on affectionate, egalitarian agreements. They are based on uncomfortable, instinctive truths that have been heavily censored by the modern world. You are 1 second away from confronting the most unforgiving reality regarding the true engine of human attraction. And it is exactly here that 99% of men voluntarily beg for their own execution. Because when she throws it in your face that you are cold and distant, if you commit the exact error I am about to outline, You will incinerate any remaining chance of ever being respected by her again. When she fires that accusation at you, your very first instinct, deeply corrupted by society's therapy culture, is to open your mouth to justify your behavior. You silently crawl on your belly for a single crumb of validation just to de-escalate the tension and calm the environment. Brother, wake up. Your nauseating neediness and your desperate urgency to be understood instantly trigger a biological response of repulsion and suffocation in her nervous system. Justifying your own actions in the face of an emotional crisis is not an act of empathy. It is the glaring, undeniable behavior of a cornered prey animal. The unbearable truth that no modern therapist will ever have the decency to rub in your face is governed by an absolute, unbreakable biological and sociological law, the principle of least interest. In the power dynamic of any human relationship, the organism that requires the least amount of emotional resources from its partner will entirely dominate and subjugate the interaction. If you require her approval to maintain your baseline sanity, you are already a voluntary slave. Consider the most lethal, highly experienced hostage negotiator in the world sitting across the table from a volatile criminal. That negotiator holds absolute, crushing control of that room, not because he is screaming, not because he is threatening, but because he is genuinely, authentically willing to stand up from his chair, turn his back, and abandon the negotiation in the exact millisecond it ceases to make sense to him. The complete absence of desperation flips the entire board. As long as you remain terrified of losing a woman's approval, you will continue to be treated as predictable, disposable collateral. The dark secret that you were programmed to ignore your entire life, the reality that completely annihilates your romanticized vision of the world, is this: she does not love you because you are a good guy. She respects you because you are strong. And without respect, female love is biologically impossible. Your tactical stillness and your categorical refusal to react are the definitive certificates proving that you do not require her presence to validate your own existence. When you violently extract the need for approval from the equation, you create a catastrophic glitch in her emotional matrix. Your calculated non-attachment operates exactly like the abrupt, violent withdrawal of a highly restricted narcotic from a chronic addict. It forces her primal system to pursue you relentlessly just to satisfy the withdrawal. This is the exact moment you cross what behavioral scientists might call the threshold of sovereign passage. This threshold represents the brutal, definitive border between the invisible man who begs for attention and survives on emotional crumbs, and the sovereign man whose mind instantly recognizes his own superior authority, an authority the woman is entirely incapable of manipulating. When you cross this threshold, her initial desperation to test you morphs into a chemical addiction to your silent approval. She cannot stop trying to decipher your mind, simply because you have become the absolute only obstacle in her environment that refuses to hand over its power on a silver platter. I know perfectly well what your fragile mind is fabricating right now to try and escape this crushing reality. You are inventing pathetic excuses. You are telling yourself that suddenly shifting your posture would be acting like a sociopath. You are rationalizing that you don't want to live in a state of constant emotional warfare, and deep down, you harbor a paralyzing fear of ending up utterly alone and rejected. What you are calling moral prudence is nothing more than cowardly cultural conditioning attempting to protect your fundamental weakness. To achieve absolute personal sovereignty, you must violently rip the parasite of female approval directly from your own brain cortex, in cold blood, without anesthesia. There is not a single millimeter of space for peaceful negotiation with your own chronic submission. If your utility as a man is measured by your capacity to withstand the storm, why do you continuously attempt to negotiate with the rain? The shock you have just experienced by listening to this was not designed to comfort you. It was surgically structured to destroy the final, lingering illusion that was still holding you hostage. What I am handing you now is not therapeutic consolation. It is the definitive tactical map for your extraction. The absolute hardening of your character is not some cheap theatrical performance or a rehearsed trick. It is the purest, most natural biological expression of a man who possesses non-negotiable standards, an unshakable life purpose, and a cynical, deeply rooted awareness of his own intrinsic value. The anatomy of nonverbal superiority explains this with frightening precision. In behavioral biology, severe verbal containment and physical immobility are the supreme, universal indicators of apex status in any primate hierarchy. The male at the absolute top of the hierarchy does not bark desperately to prove his authority. He merely observes the chaos in dead silence. You must learn to operate like an elite sniper, a man who lethargically lowers his own heart rate at the absolute climax of hellish combat. This stands in stark contrast to the amateur civilian who empties his magazine while crying with his eyes squeezed shut. Attempting to inject logic, reason, or any form of peaceful argumentation into the epicenter of a female emotional storm is the equivalent of signing the irreversible death certificate of your masculinity with your own hands. The precise behavioral instruction required to dominate this stress test demands the internalization of one imperative principle. The truly sovereign man never, under any circumstances, places a woman above his own mission and his internal axis. He does not do this out of cruelty or malice, but because he possesses the clinical understanding that the world, and female biology in particular, punishes with extreme, merciless severity the male who abandons himself in exchange for external validation. Your personal sovereignty must be constructed as an impregnable fortress, a massive retaining wall that absorbs the devastating impact of the flood without shifting a single millimeter from its foundational base. During an irrational crisis, your elite protocol boils down to the deployment of lethargically calm eye contact and dense, impenetrable silence. You must transform your physical presence into an unyielding shield. Your posture must radiate the categorical refusal to cede your own ground. Look at your reality right now and answer me with brutal honesty. Have you already built this impregnable fortress inside your mind? Or are you still living in a fragile, paper-thin structure that collapses at the first gust of wind? If you open your mouth to justify yourself to an out-of-control partner, the war is already over, and she is the undisputed victor of that power dynamic. The psychological result of this unshakable posture on the female nervous system is absolutely devastating and utterly permanent. When she projects chaos and you return nothing but heavy silence and a serene gaze, your attitude non-verbally communicates the most powerful message in human existence. I hear your noise perfectly, but it simply does not possess the biological clearance to move me. You assume the posture of the silent, meticulous apex predator, the one who paralyzes and fascinates his target not through a frantic, aggressive attack, but through a cold, calculated refusal to move in response to her agitation. It is this exact confirmation of your impassive authority that forces her subconscious to involuntarily and immediately reactivate the deepest, most overwhelming primal attraction possible. Female desire is never requested, it's triggered.